Welcome to the Spy Who Raised Me podcast. Conversations between a daughter and her father. Yes, you've guessed it, he was a spy. Hi, I'm Jane Craigie and I'm here with my dad, Iain Craigie, and he spent his career as a spy. So it created much hilarity in the family and amongst our friends. And what we're going to talk about today is his second posting in Turkey, when he was based in Ankara between 1989 and 1991, just before the first Gulf War. So, Dad, tell us a little bit about why you were there during that time.
Hi, Jeannie. You sound very awake and alert and ready to go. Yes, I was there. My function was to coordinate in the embassy the various transactions that we had with the Turkish government. Basically, the general staff who were in Ankara, at least just outside of Ankara, and the monies that were paid by the British government on a 3-year basis, under an understanding that every 3 years we reassessed what was happening. We were using Turkish facilities in Sinop, which is on the Black Sea coast. And the purpose of that was to keep track of the development within Russia of their military capacity, of their missiles, ballistic and conventional. So that was the main reason for being there. I had staff in Sinop, around 100 staff who came on 6-month tours from Cheltenham, from GCHQ. To man the facility. My office was in the embassy in Ankara. So I had to orchestrate the admin side that covered the surveillance effort in Sinop. And also I had to dovetail in with the FNCO, with the ambassador and his minions in the embassy. That, in actual fact, that wasn't that much of a chore, because the FNCO tended to keep their work and their conversation with Turkey to themselves. We did get some sort of idea of what they were feeling, what they were thinking about the GCHQ arrangements. So yeah, that was about it. There for 2 years, and an amazing experience. Not only because Turkey was such an exciting place to be, so many changes in such a vast country. And I think we look back on it and think, wow, that was so interesting. But yes, what did you think of Turkey, Jeannie? You were there.
Yeah, well, I was also going to ask you, my next question links back to my knowledge of Turkey. So we were based there as a family in the early 1970s. So I was under the age of 10, and Emma, my younger sister, was just a toddler, really, wasn't she? And we spent nearly 3 years in Istanbul. So my memories of Turkey were just a vibrant, warm culture, a beautiful country, and lots of freedom, and lots of attention from Turks, because I was a young girl with blonde hair, and there weren't many blonde children in Turkey at the time. So those are my memories, really, of Turkey, and they're very, very fond. And I'm also perpetually intrigued about Turkey as a nation, its geography, its politics, its its importance in that whole region of the Middle East. So yeah, it absorbs a lot of my thinking time still, even though it was many years ago that we lived there.
And that's the advantage of having spent time in a country like Turkey. You have an understanding of what the country is all about, and even contemporary history and the happenings in a country like that. It's so interesting to be able to follow it, but have some idea of the country as a whole.
Yeah, very much so, Dad. And you were in Turkey. Your first posting, you were in your 30s, and your second posting. So what we're talking about now, the Ankara posting, 89 to 91. You were in your late 40s. What differences can you remember from those two eras in that country?
Well, I think it has to be said that, of course, the job that I was doing in the consulate in Istanbul was totally different to the one in Ankara, and just illustrated how much had changed in the world during that period. But in Turkey, Turkey, we covered quite a lot of Turkey in different ways. We used to go to the Black Sea coast. We used to go, inland to various touristy sites. But it gave us a fairly deep understanding of what the country was like, the politics of the country, and the people. And the thing that we all agree was that the Turkish nation, the Turkish people, were very hospitable people. They were very natural people. And all our travels through and in Turkey illustrated that. I don't think we were ever in a situation where we felt threatened or where we felt that people were being inhospitable. They were just lovely, lovely people. And the difference between that period and mid 70s through to 88, 89 was quite dramatic. And the politics were different. Of course, Ataturk was the leader who started it all, becoming a secular nation instead of an Islamist nation, and that was a profound change for a country with so many customs and so many different ethnic minorities and so on. And I think at that time in the mid 70s, the political scene was quite relaxed. I mean, they had odd coup d'etats and so on, where the military, which was always very, very strong in Turkey, used to try and take over the government. But in general, it was fairly relaxed. They had problems with the Kurdistan, with the Kurdistani thing, where Kurds were trying to establish a homeland, having been evicted from their homeland in the east of Turkey and the north of Syria. So that was evident throughout. And here's my other daughter, Emma, with a cup of coffee. Thank you, Emma. So yes, so that there were quite profound changes. Not so much in the people of Ankara, but more in the political system. In the towards the end of the 80s, the whole thing changed because Erdogan, Recep Erdogan, became the president of Turkey, and his tenure of office initially, when he was elected, was quite benign. He didn't choose to create too many difficulties, but that changed quite rapidly, and he became he became more strident and more aggressive in the east with the Kurdish problem. He tried to arrange things so that the Kurds could no longer look upon the east of Turkey and the north of Syria as being their homeland, which created a lot of terrorism, and it is now probably worse than ever because he's now becoming quite aggressive and taking stances that other powers do not like. NATO, for one, the Americans are not at all happy with what he's doing. But in essence, it's spread all over the Middle East, and there are so many points of conflict that it's very difficult to see how they can reach some sort of peace and progress.
Yeah, and Dad, that time you were there from '89, and the Middle East was, it's always been a challenging region, hasn't it? Because of all of the religious differences. It's the in terms of the rivers that flow into the region, they all flow through, or the Tigris and the Euphrates flow through Turkey and into Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And it's also an area that's full of oil. So there are some very wealthy nations in the Middle East, and it makes it a very, very volatile region, doesn't it? How was that? How volatile was it back in 1989? And did you were in a fairly senior, well, in a very senior role in your base in Turkey. How did it feel to be in that position, and how volatile was it?
Yeah, no, I think that that's true, and I think at that time, 80, 89, 90, I mean, there were things happening, but they weren't quite so obvious as they are now. And I think that, especially in the embassy, we were kept informed of what was happening politically, just so that we could be aware of any changes. And there were so many pressures on Turkey. I mean, Turkey is a member of NATO, and I know that the ambassador in Turkey during those times was a Turkophile. He was very much supporting the Turkish government and Turkish people, which must have led him into some conflict because it was difficult for him to feel that way. He spoke fluent Turkish, and the NATO situation, of course, with Turkey was always a huge convenience for Europe because they were a buffer. They were a huge buffer state, if you like, between the East and the West, and to some extent, NATO were very, very aware of that because any of the conflict, I mean, even now with immigrants pouring through from the East into Europe and so on, the Turks were very much part of that, trying to solve problems, looking after their borders and so on. And those battles are still going on. I think it's difficult to see how the fact that Turkey applied for membership of the European Union some years ago and have never been accepted. So that is a huge irritation for Turkey, and it's one of the most important aspects of their relationships with Europe, the US, and so on. Now, human rights is a very big factor, and I mean, it's been argued over and over again that Turkish records in relation to human rights is not very good. But one wonders whether there will ever be a time when European Union will allow them entry into the Union, because, I mean, not so much politically, but certainly economically, they're a vibrant nation. Their industries are well developed. Their infrastructure, due to quite a bit to Erdogan, who has spent huge amounts in building roads and building infrastructure throughout the country, that it's something that will happen probably gradually, but needs to happen more quickly, I think. And also, too, their lines of communication and transport through Turkey is such a compelling reason for allowing them entry to the European Union. There's now a railway line that links up Wuhan province in China with European countries, and I mean that's huge. That's absolutely huge. It goes through Turkey, which means that export of material goods and so on is so much cheaper and takes less time. Compared with shipping, for example, the cost of transporting goods from China to Europe is about half what it is using ships. So there are a lot of things that are going well for Turkey, but unfortunately Erdogan is quite obstructive, and because of his Islamist views, not so much the fact that it's Islam, but because it's non-secular. So he's doing a lot of his decisions are made on the basis that it's an Islamic country, and doing that in this day and age is not an easy thing to reconcile.
And Dad, back in 89 to 91, one of your key roles was to keep in regular contact and dialogue with the head of the Turkish Army. Tell me a little bit about him, and also what kind of conversations you had with him and how regularly.
Yes, that was the General Staff headquarters was outside Ankara. It was about 20 kilometers from Ankara. And we met up regularly with General, he was Ziad Uran, who's in charge of Bayrak and the Turkish troops. And it was quite an eye opener because it was quite a privilege too to see inside Bayrak, to see how they function, to see how they treated their lower ranks and so on. And you could see, just even paying one visit, how tough the Turkish officers were. I mean, they stood no nonsense. They were almost, the soldiers in particular were almost in awe of officers, and they almost crawled on their hands and knees, except that standing to attention was necessary, of course. When an officer appeared, they were just so under the thumb that it was unbelievable. But I mean, the General Staff, they were very, you can imagine the furnishings and so on, very similar to what you imagine in Russia, for example, old-fashioned, very ornate furniture, and they had huge conference rooms. So we used to turn up, two or three of us, to have a regular discussion with the general and also some of his staff. He didn't speak English, and we spoke some Turkish, but not good enough to cover. So we had we had a translator. So we used to sit down and go through. There were certain topics that were discussed every time. These were mainly admin and so on. But the other more secret discussions were to do with Sinop and any impact that our efforts in Sinop might have impacted on the local population in Sinop, and it was fairly easy, and it was very sociable. You had loads of cups of tea, but there were very few issues that were brought up that were serious and couldn't be overcome. And we had such a good relationship with some of the other officers because they used to travel with us. If we visited Sinop, sometimes one of the army officers would come with us, and we had a chauffeur-driven car. So it finished up that we sat in the back seat of the car and discussed all sorts of things, and that probably was one of the main reasons why I was privileged enough to really feel that I understood what the Turkish nation was like. And we would stop in villages on the mountain. It was a very mountainous country, and the journey from Ankara to Sinop was over a very really high mountain range through a village called Kastamonu. And we always stopped there and chatted to some of the locals and had a few chais, and they looked at us and we looked at them, took a few photographs, and then down to Sinop to see, to see my staff, but also some of the local people in Sinop. So it was a great privilege, and it was a very interesting time for me anyway, and I think the family.
And Dad, describe Sinop to me. So you had 100 staff there. Where is it, and what were those staff doing in that location, and why was that location so important?
Well, Sinop was on the southern coast of the Black Sea. It was in a promontory, so it had sea all around it. And the beauty of that site was that we could see across the Black Sea to what was happening in the Crimea and other countries bordering the Black Sea, which Russia had interests in. So we had surveillance on the radar systems, and also on different types of VHF and HF communications they had between themselves and different countries where they had Russian troops. So it was ideally suited for that, and because the Turkish government allowed us to function there, I think there was some spin-off in the sense that Turkey benefited from some of the intelligence that came out of that. It was all the material that was surveyed in Sinop, of course, was sent back to Cheltenham and to NSA to be looked at to find out whether there was anything relevant to the security of various countries. So yeah, so that was it was also different because Sinop, for the first time, I think I saw what American staff and troops were like, and I was absolutely amazed. First time I went to meet my staff in Sinop, one of the ports of call was the American base, which was only, you could walk to the American base from from the one that we had. And so we used to get invited over there. They had a squash court there too, which was well used. But looking at some of the Americans, couldn't believe it. They were all hefting huge weights. That was the way they kept saying, I guess. And they were huge hulks, really, really big people, big men mainly. Some women, but mainly men. And they were sort of threatening in a way. They strode around, and they weren't that friendly. So that kind of, for me, I thought it might be an issue with some of my staff, because they mixed to some extent, and sometimes they would invite the Americans over to the bar that they ran there. But I don't think there were ever any real issues during my time there. So I think it worked quite well.
At that time, Dad, so 89, it was the year before the first Gulf War started, so Desert Storm. Were you picking up intelligence then that there was any increased activity in that geography, either from your work in Ankara or from your work at Sinop?
I can't say there was. I think that whole period leading up to that was a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, there were so many decisions made apparently so quickly, possibly without collaboration. And when it actually did happen, I think the whole world was surprised, and certainly the Turks didn't show that there was any, apart from the usual hostilities on the border with the PKK and so on, the Workers' Party in the east. I can't say there was any signs that was going to happen.
And what exactly, can you remember exactly what did happen, what the sequence of events was that led to the start of that Gulf War?
Well, I mean, you mean the Kuwaiti, the attack by the Iraqis on Kuwait? Well, I mean, Saddam Hussein, of course, was a very unpopular ruler, and he had delusions of grandeur, I think it could be said. So he was like all nations in that area, was highly interested in Kuwait's oil, and I think that was one of the main factors. And of course, with George Bush and Tony Blair being part of the Allies working together, it was very strange, the whole thing. And if you remember, can you remember the people that used to go for weapons, trying to check out what weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq? I mean, that was, we didn't get involved with that, but from the outside, it the whole thing looked plausible, and a lot of the information and intelligence that supported that and supported the Allies during that period came through GCHQ and NSA. And I can remember having long conversations with other members of staff and various doing various work within the department, saying, I wonder how accurate and how unbiased the information that is being fed into government and could be used to give a clear idea of what was happening in any country. And of course, George Bush was quite gung-ho in the sense that even the way he walked, he always looked as if he had a six-gun in his hand. And Tony Blair, I think, although he was genuine in what he said about the intelligence, he was basing his support of George Bush. He was genuine, but we used to say, well, I mean, if people within the department and within intelligence agencies were politically biased and didn't feel that the intelligence they were finding and getting and sending through to the powers that be, like governments, we often wondered if that was biased, depending on who was producing the intelligence within the department and who was passing it through, because we weren't sure whether there were any systems by which maybe unintentional bias would have conflated the evidence of there being, say, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So it was quite an education for us within the department, where intelligence was our objective, to find out after the various crises and in the Middle East that perhaps the quality of the intelligence information wasn't as accurate as it should have been and could have been.
And Dad, that's really interesting, because really your role, part of your role, you had to have deep integrity, but also objectivity, and you. It always strikes me that that intelligence is based on truth. You have to know the truth. You have to know what's actually happening. So that must have been quite uncomfortable to feel that the what you were receiving, the communications you were gathering, that some of that may not be accurate, that there may be a spin on that to suit the politicians. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. But and I think closer to the point of collection, if you like, there were quite often, depending on what the posting was and the country you were in and so on, it was obvious that it was easy to misconstrue what was happening in a country. And I remember in an Arab-speaking country, round about that time, I spent a year there, and looking at how information, especially the spoken word, was processed by translators and so on, and also the complexity of the language. I mean, the complexity of the language, say Arabic, where there are eight cases of the verb. It's very difficult on an ongoing basis to make sure that you have the right interpretation, and I think that was a vital factor, perhaps in the Middle East, where analysts and translators were listening to conversations and perhaps getting it wrong some of the time.
Yeah, so it wasn't intentional, it was unintentional.
No, yes, it was unintentional.
That's an important differentiator.
Yes. And that just another point on that. That is why now it's a sort of crossroads, because data that's collected from satellites and are fed through to the various intelligence agencies, I would think, are probably less likely to create false evidence, unless it was intentional on whichever country was doing that, to lay the scene where there were untruths and so on, just to give it that. I mean, that is a real problem, I think, with intelligence gathering, and now with cybersecurity and so on. You can see how many different ways that information is being collected and analyzed by various in various parts of the world, and being analyzed by people in central positions like NSA, like GCHQ, like Pine Gap in Australia. It must be very, very difficult to guarantee that the intelligence you have is correct.
And how does that sense check happen? Did you have people within your team or in the Ministry of Defence that would then scrutinise that information that was coming in, and look at anything that looked out of context or incorrect? Who did that sense checking?
Yeah, it depended on what the nature of the intelligence. I mean, if it was data, it was probably done by computers and so on, and various algorithms. But if it was the spoken word, then what all collection agencies did was to try and find people who spoke the language, who were probably natives of that particular area, like in Iraq or like North Africa, and we had a number of those who were totally fluent in the language, either Arabic or Turkish, whatever it was, and understood the nuances that were apparent in the spoken word. So, and that was a great source of reassurance for the intelligence agencies, to know that the person who was translating that particular voice that had been collected knew the colloquialisms and understood the dialect, and that was hugely important.
Wow, yeah, of course, but it's not something, unless you're responsible for those teams, it's not something that me as an everyday citizen considers as part of the job. But of course, it's absolutely vital. One wrong word, one incorrect connotation could be a significant problem.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why over the last 5 years, 10 years, I suppose, the quality of the intelligence to some extent has improved, because you now have drones, you now have a series of satellites that can pick up visual proof of different things. Drones that can be controlled locally in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on, so that the information that's coming through is much more difficult for would-be targets to obscure or to devalue. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah, and it takes us neatly onto technology. So through your career, you've worked with a whole range of different technologies, and we've covered them in other podcasts. But this posting, 89 to 91, when we were chatting before we started recording, you were saying that you were using radar, you were using satellites, and one of the key things that you were doing was tracking missiles. So can you tell us a little bit about the technology you were using, and what you were actually doing with that technology? What were you tracking and why?
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine in Turkey, in Istanbul, and also in Ankara, but predominantly in Sinop, there was a wide open vista that we could collect information from a number of sources and collate it in the sense that you could say, well, that confirms this and this confirms that. And with the missiles that were in use at the time, the ground missiles that were like they're using now on Syria and other countries in the Middle East, also in Israel and the Palestinian thing, those were probably easier to identify because the satellites that were in position could pick them up, sometimes on infrared and the exhaust gases that were being produced, but also with the other missiles, the ones that had a greater range. Those were being picked up by satellites too, but it's not easy because some of the up-to-date missiles, ballistic missiles, they are propelled into space and they go at phenomenal speeds from phenomenal height. So they're more difficult to pick up than conventional missiles. So that is an ongoing concern with NSA, with GCHQ, and all the intelligence agencies, how they can decide whether a country is being attacked by ballistic missiles, and they travel at a huge speed because of the fact there's no atmosphere, and also they're almost free flight from a huge altitude onto a target on Earth somewhere. So it's really interesting and changing so rapidly. I mean, I find it difficult to find out information. Of course, some of it is so it's so difficult to find because technology is moving at such a pace.
And Dad, those missiles, those ballistic missiles, how accurate were they? Are they now when you were tracking them? In terms of the site, the target site.
Yes, I mean the short range missiles now, you can hear, every week there's an attack on, say, Syria by missiles, Iran too, and those shorter range missiles are easier to pick up, and when they're activated, because they're closer for a start, they don't travel so quickly as ballistic missiles, but they're very accurate. I mean, they can land on on a tennis court. They're so accurate, which is why in some of the strife, a lot of the strife in countries like Syria, because the al-Bashar and Russia are cooperating in strikes into the heart of villages and so on, but they are deadly accurate.
And looking from your position now, so you've been retired for 20 plus years now. As you look at intelligence, look from the sidelines, I suppose you'd describe it as now, at the technology and both in terms of surveillance, but also in terms of warfare. What are your observations, Dad?
Well, I think that, you can see where the emphasis is now with cybersecurity. I mean, it's such a big issue. It's just huge. And I mean, when factions like some of the terrorist factions like Al-Qaeda and al-Bashar in North Africa, when the intelligence agencies start thinking that they have control over some of the information that's being passed from one country or from one faction to another, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And this is why all of a sudden there's this huge increase in the interest in cybersecurity, but also in ways of counteracting that. And countries like China are so far ahead, I think, on their infrastructure. I mean, it's shown now with the Chinese, this Huawei furore was because the Allies thought that China could somehow control what was happening in certain networks, and some of those networks were vital. They might be connected with control of nuclear weapons. It could be anything, and if there are ways of being able to look at the data of other countries and giving you some control over the software that they were using to control missiles, say, or troops, then it's a really very difficult thing, but so inexpensive compared with the conventional ways of having satellite dishes and so on, and loads of people to analyze what's happening. Fascinating.
It is. It's frightening as well, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it is. It's that's an interesting subject, and it's one that we all have to try and keep abreast of. But what do you think? Have you got views on that and cybersecurity? And
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think it's a massive threat because technology and ways of communicating are increasing in two ways. One is in sophistication, things like encryption, and the other is volume. How do intelligence officers keep abreast of the volume and also the amazing technology developers who are out there making it easier to communicate? The intelligence community needs to keep 2 steps ahead of all of that.
Yeah.
And that must take some doing.
Oh yes, how do you do it? I mean, you see it in a less tactical way, I guess, strategic way, with Facebook and WhatsApp and so on. I mean, keeping a hold on the information that's passing from between subscribers is just a nightmare. I mean, it can change so quickly, and unless governments get a grip of that and start making sure that these vehicles are not being used for transfer of or control of bodies like Al Qaeda and so on. I don't know how they're going to do that, but they're going to have to spend a lot of money.
Well, and it comes back to listening to you, Dad. It comes back to people. Always, it comes back to people in diplomacy, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
you're, talking about this posting that you had to Turkey. That alliance was very strong. The partnership was very strong, and in a region that requires connection and understanding. Britain having such a strong ally back then in Turkey was really, really important. And it just, that also worries me that diplomacy is not seen as it doesn't feel like it's seen as important today than it was, that you can have technology that will resolve everything, but actually people are at the heart of making relationships work or not, and understanding or not. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think I've said this often to you, that listening to comment on various troubled areas in the world, you hear some people who obviously have no background in that particular country or organization, and there's a lot of flannel and misconceptions. But if you listen to some of the experienced people who were either part of organizations that interfaced with different countries, like diplomats, I mean, some of the comment now, some of those ex ambassadors and so on, is so much on the button. I think because they were there, and they've sat and spoken with opposite numbers for years and years and years, and doing that, they get a feel for the situation that you can't do in any other way, and that certainly comes from Turkey. Some of the highly efficient people they had there, like the ambassador, like Sir Peter Westmacott is one of the outstanding commentators on different parts of the world. He was ambassador in Washington, of course, and you have to listen to people who have background, who have understanding, and I mean, it's no good listening to people who have half truths and make up the bits that they don't know of, because that's such a dangerous thing. But it's happening so frequently now that governments and officers are sidetracked by comment that is not accurate and is it's a really serious problem.
And time in country or in region is really important. You can always tell when you meet people that have been immersed in a region, and they just their understanding is almost innate about the culture of that region, the behavior, and you need to understand that depth of how people behave and why they behave in a certain way to be able to operate effectively.
Yes.
And I think
Yes.
about your role in Ankara, dealing with the general of the Turkish army. You'd already had one posting in Turkey, so you had a deep understanding of that nation and what's important to the people, and the cultural nuances of the people, and also the different regions that you were based in.
Yes.
How important do you think, given the seniority of your position in Turkey at that time, how important do you think that knowledge of Turkey, but not just Turkey, you'd been based in Saudi Arabia as well, of that region was?
Well, I think that I often say this when I'm in discussion with people about various topics, politics and so on. You have the more background you have, the more contact you've had with people of different countries, of different views, and so on, the better equipped you are to sit and listen and to discuss certain points and reach a balanced opinion, which 90% of the time is accurate and you can trust, and you can think, well, okay, I've spoken to people, I've watched them, watched the body language. And of course, ex ambassadors and people who have been in, in different countries, they're adept at that. I mean, they have, they sit and look, and you can hear some of the analysis. Oh, yes, Putin say, we'll do this. He's done this for the last 10 years and he won't change. He'll do that. And more often than not, 90% of the time, they're bang on the button. They know that that's the sort of behavior one can expect. Like in the Ukraine now, where they're having huge convulsions in the west of Ukraine, and that is invaluable. It doesn't matter how many machines, how many um, cybersecurity experts you have. At some stage, an assessment of what a country will do, how dangerous it is, like you're saying, is so valuable to have personal experience of that. People who have mixed, who've spoken to people, who have negotiated with them. I mean, it's probably the best way of assessing what's going to happen next.
I'm going to ask you, this is my last sort of area of questioning for today, Dad, but I'm also really interested, part of my role in my day job is working with and working in communities of journalists. And it always strikes me that journalists that are very focused on a region and have spent a lot of time in a region, they have almost a level of understanding that diplomats have, because they have spent so long talking to people, understanding the culture, understanding the region. In intelligence, in your role, how much contact did you have with journalists? And then my second question is, do you agree with me that journalists are important for their insight into people and certain geographies?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Your last statement there. I didn't. I mean, I've had contact with journalists over a period of years, like Jane Howard, the BBC correspondent in Turkey. We did a lot of traveling with her in the east of Turkey. Now, she was a very shrewd lady. She was so interesting to travel with. We did one trip that was about a month long, and we traveled through all the east of Turkey. But she all the time presided over the local situation and the difficulties and the possible answers to some of the questions, like in the PKK region east of Turkey. And you could see that she had such a deep knowledge of what was going on, which allowed her, when she was reporting on areas like that, to give a real depth of understanding and realism for those particular areas. And I think some of the good journalists, you listen to them, some of the ones who are now functioning in the Middle East, you just say, "Wow, that is incredible! They have so much information." And I think that because politics and economics and so on can obscure that facet of reporting, especially areas in the world that are under huge pressure, it must be that there are better ways of conveying their expertise and knowledge into the wider frame. And I think more often than not, now you get this very narrow, politically motivated points of view. That if they listen to journalists, really good journalists who'd been around and like who shall I say, Lise Doucette, she's one who is, I mean, where she goes, she does it time and time again. She gets right into the heart of what's happening, say, in Syria. You've got to listen to them and realize that they have up-to-date knowledge, and they're not looking at political bias. They're just saying, this is what we saw.
And Dad, do they, final question, do they play a part in intelligence gathering and informing your peers about what's happening in a region?
Journalists,
yeah,
you're talking about. I think there's very little of that, because I think there's a certain amount of in intelligence agencies. I mean, obviously, the job is to get as much information as possible that is credible and useful in the sense of devising strategies. The trouble with that is that the media are so fond of themselves and have such definite biases for various political parties, say, or people, I mean, you've got to start looking at what the outlets are and say, well, I do understand that. And I think that more often than not, those reporters who are going to foreign for like in the Middle East, say, you can rely on them. Whereas people who are analysing what's being said, creating a bias which is maybe unintentional, means that looking at journalists for intelligence input, you would have to be very selective.
That's really, really interesting, Dad. That's a very, I've never asked you about that before, but that's a very, from somebody who was in a role where you were objective and seeking the truth. It's very interesting hearing that view, and I can completely understand it. There is unconscious bias that comes into journalism for sure.
That's good. Yeah, you've come across that because you're working with media and journalists all the time, and do you find that you over the years you can have interviews and so on, and you make a judgment sometimes on the veracity of some of the information that you're being passed, and I should think the longer you do that, the more adept you become at making a decision and saying, well, I can believe that or I can't believe that. Do you find that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, you do, and the unconscious bias comes from many reasons. It arises, doesn't it? Your points of reference, your experience, your knowledge. It's not. It really isn't intentional. Good journalists will never intend to be biased in their reporting, but sometimes it happens just because of the context from which they are debating or reporting on a situation. And that's just human nature, isn't it?
Yes.
And that's why diplomats are such an amazing breed of people, because they maintain objectivity and reason throughout. They're not trying to get a headline. They're not trying to make a story out of something that doesn't exist. It is purely objective, always.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, thank you very much, Dad. We could talk about Turkey for another 4 hours, I'm sure. It's such a fascinating country and region, and the history of that area is just vast, isn't it, on so many levels. But it's been really lovely talking to you about your time there, and just how that time fed into what is has become such a volatile region. One country pops up as being troubled, then another. Iran, Iraq, Syria. It's constantly in the news, and it's just about time when you were in Ankara, 89 to 91, was really the start of the modern day conflict that we're seeing in that geography. So it's been so interesting hearing the roots of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Jenny. You're very good. You. And we'll make a date for the next one, shall we?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dad. And you'll be going off for your roast dinner with my sister, Emma. What are you having this evening?
I don't know. I don't know if we're having a roast dinner.
Is it barbecue? Barbecue season?
Barbecue season, but yeah, they might do. But our project with the allotment is producing a lot of salad leaves and tomatoes and things. So it's great.
That's great. Well, that community project, that setting up the community polytunnel, has been such a big part of your COVID experience, hasn't it? Yeah, and what a positive thing to come out of COVID.
That's true. So, well, thank you very much, Jenny, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Dad. Well, thanks ever so much. And I'll chat to you soon. So we will record, the next podcast we're going to do is on Dad's time in Hong Kong, which was just before his posting to Ankara in 88 and 89. So thank you very much, Dad. And thank you to all of you out there who listen to us.